This is our Game of Thrones live show. We're going to be discussing the chapters that we read this week for the reread. Those chapters are going to include Tyrion's first chapter, also Jon's second chapter, and Dany's second chapter. So what we're going to do is I'm going to be inviting a couple of guests on here to talk specifically about a certain chapter. And we're going to go through all the discussion questions that were posted on the Facebook group. So we're going to go through those kind of one by one. We're going to share just any thoughts that we have that we want to share. And if you guys have any questions you want to throw at us, we'll gladly answer them to the best we can. We'll kind of fit them in as we go. But right now we are going to be discussing Tyrion's first chapter in the Game of Thrones, and we are going to be inviting Madison Goodyear on to discuss that chapter with us. Hi, Stacy. It's good seeing you. So I'm going to invite Madison on here, and we're going to get rolling. Hey, Madison.
Hey, we're here.
Okay,
All
let's
right.
see. So we're going to be talking about Tyrion's first chapter. I wanted to just give just a quick summary of what happens in this chapter, and I'm probably just going to use the summary I posted up on the group. Tyrion's first chapter, basically, so Tyrion's up all night, reading in the library. He finishes up for the day. He lets the Septon know that, hey, I'm finished with the books. Make sure you put them back right, or else we just don't want these rare and valuable books to be destroyed. Heads out to the training yard, meets up with Joffrey, who's being an absolute little shit, and chats with him, sort of disciplines him, because he hasn't gone to sort of pay his respects to the Starks for Bran falling out of the tower. After that, he goes and he has breakfast with the siblings. He breaks the news that Bran is probably going to live. Madison, I was curious, what did you think about this chapter just in general?
So I really enjoy this chapter. I read it several times, and each time I feel like I just found like other little nuggets that were pretty insightful. But what was most interesting to me was I just got a completely different vibe from Tyrion in the books than I did from the show. And maybe it's just the way I'm interpreting it, but I feel like on the show, they just intentionally made him be so much, more arrogant and unlikable in the beginning. And I think they do that on purpose so that they could build in a story arc, a character arc. They build in that ability to make someone redeemable. But and I don't think in the books it's necessary because, in my opinion, from the beginning, Tyrion is nothing but good and likable. What I wrote down is just from this very first chapter. These are the things we know about Tyrion. He is a scholar. He's an intellect. He has a curious mind. We know that he's adventurous because he plans on, going further north to piss off the edge of the earth, or however he says it. We know that he's patient. It says that he was patient with the Septon. He has a good sense of humor because he was able to take the ridicule from the Hound and just let it roll off his back and just say, hey, it is what it is. I might as well have a good sense of humor about it. I think he's brave because he stood up to Joffrey, even knowing that Joffrey could, rain hell down on him if he wanted to. I don't know. I thought it was interesting that you worded it like physical abuse or something, or even you said discipline just now. And to me, that's just not how I saw it. I just felt like Joffrey, he was probably the only person who was ever honest with Joffrey and kind of put him in place. I feel like if Joffrey had lived and Tyrion had been allowed to be more involved in his life, then they could have had a different outcome because he needed someone to be honest with him and show him some harsh truth sometimes. We know that Tyrion was respectful of the Starks and what they were going through, even though he knew that going and paying your respects wouldn't change the outcome. It was just it was the right thing to do. He was also self-loathing. He said he hated his image in a mirror. What would it be like to have a twin? He was self-loathing, very attentive. He noticed things. That goes along though with being, smart and clever. And then the main thing I noticed is that he's super observant because he noticed the glance between Jaime and Cersei. And that said enough to him. He immediately caught on to what was going on. He also had that thought about the wolves keeping Bran alive. He had that, he made that connection that there was some sort of, otherworldly, if you'd put it that way, connection between the Starks and their wolves. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that in one chapter, you pick up that much on his character. And really, in the show, it's just completely different because he wakes up in the stockyards or something, after having a hangover. He wasn't up all night reading in the stories. He was up all night drinking and whoring. And then he was just much more arrogant in the show.
Actually, his original introduction in the show is actually him, and he's with Roz in the whorehouse.
And he's in the whorehouse, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. They kind of play that game where, she doesn't know that, it's Tyrion Lannister, and
Yeah.
she says like, oh yeah, I heard there's the handsome brother and there's the twisted evil imp one. Well, actually, what I did like about that in the show is when she mentions that he gets kind of like, oh, I hate that name, and it kind of shows us just a little bit like, oh, okay,
a little bit of like,
yeah, he doesn't. Like
I'm not all hard and cool. Mm-hmm. He has triggers.
Exactly, and actually, so to go off of that, you mentioned that one line in the book where it talks about him not wanting a twin of himself. Now, what I find kind of interesting is that Tyrion would hate to have a twin of himself, but his siblings who are twins, they love having a twin of themselves.
Oh yeah,
to be honest, like I've read a couple different things. Basically, people talk about like Cersei, like when she's making love with Jaime, she's basically making love with herself, kind of a thing. Same with Jaime's
and it's interesting that in the show how the other person she chooses to have sex with is her cousin, and I think it's just a further extension of her self-absorbedness. Like Jaime was an extension of herself, and Lancel was also just an extension of if I can't make love to a mirror, then I'll just have sex with my likeness. Oh, so yeah. But it's important to show that these Lannisters, where they're coming from with their mindset of being self-absorbed. But to me, just Tyrion just seems really different.
So between the book and the show, what intro did you like? Did you like this sort of intellectual Tyrion that they have in the book? He's in the library, he's reading, or did you like the introduction of him being in the whorehouse, kind of being this lecher, this like what do you think?
So I started with the shows, and I never disliked the Tyrion that was introduced in the shows, but now knowing what I know of Tyrion in the shows, and then really taking it in through the books, I do prefer book Tyrion, but show Tyrion doesn't turn me off at all. Like I still am very intrigued by his character, because even still you can still pick up on the kindness and the smarts and the cunning nature of him, and that's what's so interesting about his character is that he can be both kind and cunning, and at the same time. Like we don't have to be one without the other.
No, I agree. I honestly, like if I had to pick one, if I put a gun to my head, I'd say I probably do prefer the book version a little bit more. I do kind of, like, you don't really get, I can't remember when it happens in the book that Tyrion first sleeps with a whore, or you kind of get this, like, oh, like, he's sort of this little,
I think the first time they really bring it up is when he says, Jaime's like, oh, little brother, are you going to leave us for the wall? And he was like, oh, no, the whores would cry out from here to there. So, like, they definitely make it known that he's
that's true. That is a good point. I love that line, by the way.
Yeah, and I do like how in the books, this is Tyrion's first chapter, but he's really introduced to us in Jon's first chapter. And again, I love that immediately they show that he's smart, he's observant, but he's also kind and can relate to people from having a hard life himself. He can relate to people, on a different level than they might be seen otherwise.
Okay, now here, help me try and remember something. So in the show, we get that scene between Jon and Tyrion, and we also get the scene. I guess no, hold on. I think I just figured it out. I just think it's interesting how in the show it went from this, raunchy little dwarf, and then boom, he pops up and he's like, "Hey, guess what? I got some great quotes I could just slam down on you, Jon, and give you some wisdom." And in the book, it's kind of like, hey, here's this wise dwarf, and guess what? He's still wise, and he's just got a little bit of a raunchiness.
It's kind of a different. They just prioritize his traits in different ways. But I mean, it's TV and sex sells, and
pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did get some of your thoughts about Tyrion disciplining Joffrey. So you're kind of fine with that? You'd say yes.
I am. Again, I mean, it's a different time. Like, a made up time, but I think that Joffrey needed someone that was honest with him and strict with him and just wouldn't put up with this bullshit. And Tyrion was maybe the only person who treated them that way. So I feel like it was necessary, because what did Joffrey do? He turned around and did the right thing. And if that had been more consistent in his life, maybe he would have continued to make good choices. Even if they're forced, you're still doing them. And eventually they might become more natural to you. So I don't know. I have no problems with it. And I love that scene.
Right. Actually, let's see. I'm trying to remember. It's either in the book that he hits Joffrey 3 times, and in the show, I think it's only twice. And it's like, bam! At least we got a little more in the book,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah. Let's see. The other end of that argument is a lot of people. I've read a couple people talk about, like, actually, so as you read later on the books, we find out that Robert actually did physically abuse Joffrey. There's one scene they talk about where he basically hit Joffrey hard enough that Stannis thought he died, which is really intense.
That's pretty hard.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. So
and that's different than being like, like lashes or something, because that was like a common punishment in like medieval times for like an older child especially would be to receive lashes or something like that. But hitting someone so hard that you think they might die is a whole different ballpark.
Because also I think we can agree that Cersei, I think, spoiled the snot out of him,
right? Because
I think it was probably you who brought up the whole talking about how Rob is sort of treated younger.
Yes.
Yeah. I think you're the one who brought it
sheltered
up.
Was my
more sheltered. You got Joffrey, who's like, oh yeah, I've trained with live steel before, and I get to go on the hunt with my father, and Rob's kind of like, oh well, I want to do that too,
Yeah.
And so I think that's evidence that Cersei's totally spoiled him, and he gets whatever he wants.
Right.
And I'm kind of I do lean more towards that Tyrion physically disciplining Joffrey and being like, bro, you got to get your shit together.
Yeah.
I'm totally fine.
It's more like a wake up. Like, what are you thinking, man? Yeah.
Exactly. Well, especially if it comes to the conversation the Hound and Joffrey were having. I mean, it really shows how, just terrible Joffrey is. He's basically like, oh, God, Bran's making so much noise because he's...
I know. I love your point you made. That sounds exactly like something Robert would say. So he was definitely mimicking his father in that. Right. They're like, oh, the sound of women screaming. I just can't handle it. It's just so obnoxious. Like, that's his biggest concern is how irritating it is for him. And
that's like the most selfish thing. I want to propose like a little scenario for you here.
Okay.
So when Tyrion shows up, talk with the Hound and with Joffrey, the Hound sort of does this little like thing. Like he basically says, he goes, a voice from nowhere, Sandor said. He peered through his helm looking this way and that. Spirits of the air. So he's like pretending that he can't see Tyrion. And I remember reading that and being like, whoa, I literally can't imagine the Hound doing that.
I know.
Like it's such a weird sort of feel for me.
And I read your question and I thought about it for a while. And the thing is, I don't really have a great answer because it's still like you. It doesn't make sense to me, especially because in the book it says that the prince laughed as he always laughed when his bodyguard did this murmurous farce. Tyrion was used to it by now. So it was something that happened all the time, enough so that it was a favorite little trick he did for Joffrey, and Tyrion was just used to it. Not just going off of show Hound, but even as we go in further in the books, like it just doesn't make a lot of sense for his character because like he just doesn't give an F. Like he doesn't give a crap about what Joffrey thinks. He doesn't give a crap really about what like the knights think. Like at first I thought, well, maybe he's trying to show off because he wants to be a knight. But then I remembered, I'm like, the Hound hates knights. He doesn't want to be a knight. He refused to be knighted. Okay, so it's not that. And I just don't feel like he ever cared what Joffrey really thought of him. So maybe he literally just enjoyed it. Like maybe he just enjoyed continuing to make Tyrion feel small. Maybe he enjoyed just helping further Joffrey's terribleness. Maybe that was just kind of fun for him. Like, oh, let's take this little shit kid and just make him shittier. I mean, I honestly don't have a great response to that because I thought about it and I even like went back and read stuff from other chapters and books and it was just mean,
You're right. At least in my mind, the way I think about it is I think you're very close. So let's take Joffrey completely out of the situation. So it's just the Hound and it's just Tyrion. Now, imagine if the Hound said that same line to like Tywin. Do you think the Hound could get away with that?
No.
Yeah, no, not at all. He totally couldn't get away with saying
something. So I was like, no, don't do that.
Yeah, right?
I was scared just thinking of what would happen to him.
Exactly. So I think what it is, it's really just the Hound. Tyrion's in this weird middle ground. He's got this royal name of Lannister that commands respect. He's part of one of the most powerful houses in all of Westeros, but he's a dwarf. He sort of has this lower status just because of who he is. And I think that's why the Hound got away with it. If we fast forward a little bit to the end of this conversation, Tyrion disciplines Joffrey. Joffrey ends up going to pay his respects. And then the Hound says something along the lines of like, hey, the prince is going to remember that you did that. And Tyrion responds with, you know what? He probably will.
See to it that he does. Yeah.
He says, be a good dog and remind him. Now imagine this. Let's take Tyrion out of the situation. Let's put in, I don't know, some peasant in his place. If a peasant said that to the Hound.
Or even like another night or something.
Yeah.
He would have been like, let's go.
Yeah, right? He'd be like, bro, dude, I'm going to cut your head off now. So I think...
It's almost like they had like a mutual, you rag on me, I rag on you, and we hate each other, but we're kind of friends for it, kind of physically deformed. They were both rejects by their family. They were both, well-respected, highborn families, but they were both the bastards, brokens, crippled things. They were that of their family. And so maybe it was a mutual respect, and that was just the way that Twisted people showed it. I don't know.
Right. No, I think that's a pretty good answer. I think they're not really on the same level because Lannister is still
right.
house. But
right.
I think they can kind of get at each other and not have any consequences because of it. Let's see. Did you have any other thoughts about this chapter? Just in general?
Okay. So let me look at my notes really quick. Oh, I love the line, death is so terribly final while life is so full of possibilities. I love that line. Like, that's just a really good line.
So I was literally just looking at my note on that. What I find interesting is that line is literally the opposite of what Albus Dumbledore says in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
He says, he's like, death is the next great adventure.
Right.
I just remember the first time I read that, I thought, wow, that's completely the opposite of how Dumbledore thinks versus what Tyrion thinks. So I thought that was a great quote. I did like the kind of quip that Tyrion says to Joffrey. Tyrion hopped off the last step onto the yard. I beg to differ, nephew, he said. The Starks can count past 6, unlike some princes I might name. I just thought that was
And it was funny that was enough to shut him up, too.
Oh, yeah.
It was enough to where he was like, you know what? Fair. I am stupid. Okay, so the only thing else I have really written down, which I did highlight and write down about the wolf, his observations about the wolf. I thought that was interesting. How he would say, I would swear that the wolf was keeping the boy alive, and then he went on to explain why he thought that. How when they silenced the wolf, he would digress, and when they would let the wolf howl and keep the window open, then he would stabilize. I was just wondering what you thought. Do you think that there was literally a magical connection between Bran and Summer, or do you think it was more that his subconsciousness was just comforted by knowing his wolf was nearby? Like, what is your interpretation of that?
So I'm of the belief that magical connection between the wolves and the Stark children were there from the very beginning. Let's see, if I'm remembering correctly, Bran is holding Summer back when they first found Theon. Theon basically mentions, we need to kill them. Like, they're not going to survive, so let's kill them. And Bran shudders and Summer shudders all at the same time. So I think there was that magical connection and Summer was basically like trying to help him, trying to send
life
him,
force, energy.
Yeah, send him the energy.
No, I like that.
Trying to keep him up. I think there's definitely more to it because what are the chances? What are the chances that these wolves lined up so perfect with the Stark children? You know what I mean?
Yes.
They all get one, all the same gender, things like that. I did mention this in the group in a comment, but I do want to bring it up here. I do love the line. It's at the very end when Jaime and Tyrion are talking.
I wonder if we're about to talk about the same thing.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think this really leans towards Tyrion's observation of Jaime at one point, where he doesn't really care about anything right now. He's very aloof about things.
It says he laughed at it or never took anything seriously or something like that. Yeah,
right? And so in the end of this chapter, he's basically saying, let's see, even if the boy does live, he will be a cripple, worse than a cripple, a grotesque, give me a good clean death. To me, there's two sides of that. First off, you got the ironicness of it, that Jaime is going to be a cripple.
He'll lose his sword hand,
Yeah, he's going to lose his hand, which is a giant part of Jaime's story. I mean, it completely changes who he is.
Yes.
And so you have that side, that kind of ironicness. And then you have the other half where Jaime's basically saying, like, man, being a cripple sucks. It would ruin me. It just kill me if that happens to me. And he's talking to his brother Tyrion.
It's basically a massive diss. Like, it's like he's saying, have you ever considered just killing yourself? Like, it must be terrible to be you. Like, it's like a huge diss. Okay, I highlighted this where he says, I hope the boy does wake. I would be most interested to hear what he might have to say. His brother's smile curdled like soured milk. Tyrion, my sweet brother, he said darkly, there are times when you give me cause to wonder whose side you are on. At that moment, they both knew the truth. Tyrion knew about Jaime and Cersei, and Jaime knew that Tyrion knew. Why else would Jaime say that? Because you think he'd just be like, yeah, sure, I hope he wakes up too, whatever, But instead, he goes, there are times when you give me cause to wonder whose side you're on. And I think that points to the fact that I think sometimes Jaime is overlooked as being smart as well, because the Lannisters were clever. And he may not have been the most clever of the Lannisters, because think about who he's up against. He's up against Tywin and Tyrion and Cersei. And he was just known as being beautiful and fancy and a Kingsguard and a swordsman and all this stuff, Kingslayer, that overtook his other traits. And I think he probably buried it himself by that whole nonchalant, not caring thing. But that to me alone is enough. Like, he picked up on that pretty quickly, that Tyrion knew that they were somehow involved in Bran's accident. I thought that was interesting to note. And now it makes me want to be even more aware of paying attention to Jaime in the rest of the books and looking for clues for him being clever again.
I think it tells a lot about Tyrion. I think they kind of have this mutual, like, hey, we know this big secret. We both know what's going on. But Tyrion doesn't say anything, and I think that does...
And also, Jaime never says anything. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't go, hey, Cersei, by the way, our brother that you hate? He knows.
Because really, Jaime's the only one who's ever loved Tyrion, who's ever really cared about him, and I think that's a good testament to it. Good job. So, in this chapter, Jon's heading off to go to the Night's Watch, and he's basically saying his goodbyes. I'm assuming that a lot of these goodbyes do happen off screen. I doubt that Jon was like, yeah, whatever, Sansa and Ned, whatever. But we do get 3 goodbyes that are pretty pivotal throughout the whole book, in my opinion. First, we get a meeting with Catelyn and Bran. Jon's super terrified. He's scared to basically go in to go see Bran because Catelyn hasn't left his side the whole time that he's been, in bed and, unconscious. But he goes in, says goodbye to Bran. Catelyn says some pretty terrible things to him, and then he leaves. He then goes down, meets Robb. They kind of have this nice kind of respectful, like, hey, bro, we're cool. I'm heading off now. Peace out, whatever. And then he stops by the blacksmith, picks up a gift that he has for Arya. He goes to say goodbye to Arya. He gives her needle, her sword that she's going to hold on to for the rest of the series. And they have this really warm goodbye. And actually, just on that note, the very last line in this chapter is it's one of those, like, you read it and you're like, dang, that was really good. Basically, it says, the memory of Arya's laughter warmed him on the long ride north. And I don't know, like, I read that and I just get all the fuzzies inside. Like,
I do too.
This is good. This is great. So what did you think about this chapter? Did you like it? Was it like, bleh?
No, I love it. And this is, again, you get this a lot, especially in these first several chapters, but throughout the first book in general, where there are certain chapters that are just almost word for word in the show as well. And this was one that I was just like, they just nailed this on the show. Everything from the tension in the room with him and Catelyn to his quick but meaningful goodbye with Robb. It wasn't long, it wasn't drawn out, it wasn't like, oh, my brother, it was just like, well, I'll see you soon.
I feel like it was a scene that they were like, okay, we want to cry because we're not going to see each other ever again.
But we're men now.
But we're not,
And then again, in his goodbye with Arya was also just wonderfully captured in the show. One thing that they did in the show that they didn't do in the books that I actually think was a massive upgrade was the scene with Cersei and Catelyn. Because that to me was so good. Because it was one of 2 or maybe 3 instances where you really saw Cersei vulnerable. She was doing it for a reason. She went in there for her own good. But I do believe there was a moment when she was truly vulnerable with Catelyn. She was going in there to check it out for herself. And so that she could cover her own tracks and see them for herself and make it look like she was empathetic. Like, don't worry, she was there for her own good. But I do believe that she was genuinely vulnerable as well. And I thought that scene was so good in the show. So that was one, if you're keeping an invisible scoreboard of like, ding, one for the show, one for the book. Yeah. I feel like that's one for the show for sure. I wish that had been in the books, but...
Let me ask you this. So there's been countless theories just based on that one scene that get kind of annoying to read. But so do you think she was lying at all to Catelyn? Do you think she made up the story about her? No? I don't think so either.
No.
Personally.
And of course, there's the theories that it was baby Gendry and all that. I don't get into all that necessarily. But you can get muddled up in that stuff, but I do believe it was true. And I think that the truth is verified when she has that other scene with Robert, where she's like, I love, like, I truly loved you. And you broke my heart, blah, blah, blah. Like, that scene is just like,
that
bow down.
Yeah.
That scene is so
seriously.
good.
That was one of those scenes that I watched and I was like, why wasn't that in the book? Because that was just, it's really
Yes.
powerful. You know, when we get to that point, we can really.
But I'm saying, I think that the truth of the scene we're talking about is verified by that scene in the future, because there's, like I said, there's a few instances where you know that she's being truly vulnerable and showing her softer side. And so I did enjoy that. I wish it was in the book.
So Jon goes in to say goodbye to Bran, and I mean, we just get the cold shoulder from Catelyn. She's just like, why the hell are you here? What's going on? There hits a point where she basically says, like, it should have been you. You should have died instead of Bran. Let me ask you this. So at this point, it says that Catelyn's been by Bran's side for a fortnight. Which is 2 weeks. I figured that one out. She's sleeping there. Chamber pots are being brought to her. All her meals are brought there. Would you say that we can forgive Catelyn of those words because of her mental state?
So first of all, if it were an isolated incident, then I do think it could be a lot easier to understand and forgive. But it sounds like Jon has been enduring this for a lifetime. Here's something I noted, that immediately after she said that, "It should have been you," she told him. Then she turned back to Bran and began to weep, her whole body shaking with sobs. Jon had never seen her cry before. So I like to think that part of that was a little bit of instant regret for the absolutely terrible thing she had just said. She said it, she meant it, but she turned around to sob because she knew it was terrible. I don't think she regretted it, but so when I read it, that's kind of how I saw it. She said it. And she meant it. Like, she looked him in the eyes and she said it, and she turned around almost to punish herself. Like, you're a horrible person. I still mean it.
I can't believe I hit this point in my life.
Yes, I mean it, but
interesting.
It sucks.
I've never heard someone say it like that.
I thought, I wonder if that was a little bit of instant, like, shame almost.
Yeah, right? I get you. I think you talked about it not being an isolated incident. If you read before Jon even walks into the room, he's like scared, basically. And I think that really shows us how Catelyn has treated Jon. I don't think she physically abused him.
No.
Or something like that. But I think it was very she excluded him at any moment she could.
Right, and we get that from Catelyn 1. We get that, not Catelyn 1, Catelyn 2. Whatever it was last week that we read when Maester Luwin came to her chambers. Because immediately she's like, well, what are you going to do with Jon? He can't stay here.
Yeah, period.
Like, she jumped straight to it. Like, well, he ain't staying here. Right. And you could almost see Ned kind of pleading with her. Like, oh, God, he can't go with me. And she's like, well, he's not my kid. Like, he is not staying here. Like, she could give two shits about what happened to him. And so, like, that to me was kind of setting up this.
What I find interesting, so I can think of two moments where I'm assuming Catelyn and Ned sort of had to have this conversation where they basically had to figure out what to do with Jon. So you got the moment where, what do we do with Jon? Do we send him to the Night's Watch? Does he stay here at Winterfell? Whatever, what do we do? And then there's the previous Jon chapter where he was excluded from sitting up at the high table. Now, when it comes to what to do with Jon, I feel like Ned is like, okay, hold on. Like, I'm not just going to let him out in the cold. I'm not just going to send him. We got to figure this out. But I do feel like when it came to like, hey, Jon's not going to sit at the high table, I wonder if Ned was just like, okay, fine. Like,
right, and that's understandable to me. I think it might have been weird for a bastard to sit with the king. Like,
which is kind of ironic considering Joffrey and all them are bastards.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. But I'm saying, to me, that never bothered me quite as much as some of the others, because I feel like that was just how it was in the times. Like you said, a bastard wouldn't go to court. A bastard wouldn't sit at a feast with the king either. So that to me wasn't like a slight against him necessarily. It was just the appropriate thing to do. Now, did he have to sit in the back with the servants? Like, I don't know. Like, there probably could have been like a table in the middle he could have sat at.
Yeah, right. But
he didn't seem to mind. Like, it sounded like he was just getting drunk and playing with his dog anyway. So, I mean, it sounds more fun than sitting next to Joffrey.
Which is kind of the attitude he had. He was just like, whatever, I can drink all I want.
You can take full advantage of it.
So me personally, in terms of back to the question of like, can we forgive Catelyn based on her mental state? I'm kind of along with you. Like, it wasn't an isolated incident.
Yeah.
And I think I've talked to a lot of people about things like this, and they say, like, usually, like, when you're tired and when you're hit down to your bare bones, you really show who you actually are. And I think that's basically what's happening here.
I think so too. And it gives you such a strong sense of who she is from the very beginning that I personally was never able to like Catelyn, show or book Catelyn, which a lot of people are like, I don't like show Catelyn, but I like book Catelyn. Right. I never did, Like I personally, other than being, fierce and loyal, and she had some admirable qualities, but for the most part,
I know there's a lot of debate on some of her choices. Like if it was a
right?
or a wrong thing, I think this is definitely wrong.
I
I don't
do
think
too. Yep.
I don't know. I just like I can understand why, but that doesn't make it right. I think partially the reason she's so terrible towards Jon is I guess she's worried about like who's going to take over Winterfell after Ned's dead.
Right.
Because if you look back,
if only she had known that Jon doesn't want it.
Right. Exactly.
I don't want
it. So she is just worried about the line of succession. Like there have been bastards in the history of Westeros that have rebelled, have tried to take over Westeros. There's a famous one called the Blackfyre Rebellion, which was related to the Targaryens and everything. Maybe she's thinking that. So it's like, okay, I can kind of understand why you're being a little harsh towards him and making sure that he doesn't feel like he has any claim to Winterfell at all.
Right.
But still, you're kind of being a dick.
So, well, and it brings, again, not to get way too far off track, but it brings you back also to Ned's decision, because you said you can understand why she did it, but that doesn't make it right. I understand 100% why Ned never told her. But at some point, you have to wonder, was that the right choice? Because he was looking out for the welfare of Jon, and it seems like he endured a lot of abuse from her, again, not physical or whatever, but like it was really unfair for him to have to live his life like that. And again, I think in the beginning he was right not to tell her because he barely knew her. But as she became, a true Stark and, was loyal to him and fell in love with him, I wonder if it would have been a better choice to tell her the truth. But at the same time, Ned is not known for being smart. He's known for being honorable.
Right. Well, especially if you think back to what's the word? Especially if you think back to when, like, childhood wise, I think we get some observation into how Robb and Jon grew up together because they're about the same age,
right?
And I'm if I'm remembering correctly, there is a scene or two where it talks about like, I remember when Robb was able to play with the sword and be able to go spend time with Dad, and I wasn't able to because my mom didn't let me or whatever.
Right.
There's a point when Catelyn kind of opens up to Jon almost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? She talks about like, oh, like I wanted him to stay and this is my punishment.
Yeah, I think the reason she decided to tell him that was because she knew that her words would be safe with him. She knew that Jon would never turn around and go tell somebody else what she said. He wouldn't dare. Like, it's true. That would be, he would never even think of doing that. If she opened her mouth and said something to him ever in his life, he probably was just like, okay, if you say so. So I think it was a chance for her to get it off her chest and say it with knowing that it wouldn't be repeated or misconstrued by somebody. I think she needed to tell somebody, and she knew that he was about to leave. She knew that he wouldn't disrespect her by, telling her secrets. I think she needed to get it off her chest, basically.
Right, yeah. I need to say this, and you're a safe person. I can tell this to. Okay, I like that. That satisfies me. The order that we see these visits is we see Catelyn, then Robb, and then Arya. Now, how do you think the tone of the chapter would have changed if it was flipped? That he went and saw Arya first, he then saw Robb like normal, but then he ended on the meeting with Catelyn.
I think that he would have enjoyed his goodbyes to the siblings a little more if he hadn't have been so beaten down by what he just heard from Catelyn. And also, not even if Catelyn wasn't in the room, I think seeing your little brother like that is going to kind of change your mood for the rest of the day or week or year or whatever. And so I think he would have enjoyed his goodbyes a little more if he had stopped off to see Arya and then Robb and, said some goodbyes to people who are really going to miss him, and then went to the room of the silent brother who might die and the stepmom who hates you. Maybe, but then again, I don't know. Maybe he would rather leave on the note of Arya's hug. So, like you said, it could warm him the whole way to the wall or whatever. So I think it would have changed it, but I don't know which would have been better, really.
I get you. So the way I see it is, as we read through the books, this chapter is actually referenced a decent amount, especially that there's a quote in the book where it talks about Robb standing in the middle of the yard with snow melting in his hair, looking like a leader. And lots of times the Stark kids will think back to that very moment. And I think what it does is, throughout the books, I feel like the Stark children are all trying to get back to Winterfell. They want to go home, but they can't reach it. I feel like what this chapter does on its own, like the way it's supposed to be laid out, is he says goodbye to Arya, he leaves, and it leaves this like, man, like Winterfell is a great place. I want to go back there. It leaves a good taste in his mouth, kind of thing, you know. And I feel like if it was flipped and we ended on Catelyn,
he would have been like,
yeah, right, yeah. I feel like it would be like, screw you, I'm done with you. I'm off to the Night's Watch, and I don't care about Winterfell anymore.
No, that's a really good observation.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's how Jon personally, like, you know, him as a person would think that way, but we as a reader, we read that and we think, wow, okay, Winterfell really means
well,
something.
And it's kind of just like in the show, like you're just like, and like, so like as you've read the books and as you've watched the show a few times, every time I go back and watch those first 2 episodes, I'm just like, my gosh, they're all in Winterfell.
Right?
Everyone's in Winterfell. So I think that's the exact thing it leaves him with is, oh my gosh, remember Winterfell? I think you're right.
So great. Yeah, well,
it's like watching the first 2 episodes.
Right. Well, it also just blows my mind. There's so many scenes where it's like, wow, this is the only scene where Jon and Catelyn talk. Wow, this is the only scene where, like, what blows my mind, in the books, and I believe in the show, there's no scene between Sansa and Jon. Like, you never see them talk.
I know. I remember when the actual reunion happened on the show.
Right?
Being like, you know, so happy, and they were crying and hugging, and then you're like, have I ever seen them talk before?
No, that's what blows my mind. Is it's like, wow, I have all these emotions,
and again,
so
I think
happy they're together.
It's what you said though. Even for them on the show, I think it was less about Sansa and Jon. It was about Winterfell coming back together.
Yeah, right.
It was the memories and the nostalgia.
Yeah, right. It was just
something familiar.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's bring Brooke on now, and we'll talk about the Dany chapter, and then we'll kind of do some wrap ups. But let's get Brooke on here now. We are going to talk about the Dany chapter.
Yeah.
How excited are you?
I'm very excited.
Good. I love it. So, okay, I'm going to do just a quick little summary of the chapter, and then we'll get into the questions. Okay, so today I'm gonna read this one. I unfortunately only got to read this chapter once this week. I had a very busy week, so I'm just gonna read it straight. It says, "Today is the day of Dany's wedding, and she couldn't be more terrified. While Viserys complains of the Dothraki culture, Dany's in fear of it as she watches men fighting and killing each other over women and all this. It's just this huge Dothraki culture bomb, basically.
Oh yeah, it's great. Yeah,
she's trying to get used to it. While she tries to be brave." There's this dream that keeps coming back to her, and it basically puts the fear back into her, and she just can't really shake it. Then we have gifts that are presented to her. We get a gown made out of the skin of 1,000 mice, which I think every woman needs. Personally.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, nothing to make your skin crawl or anything.
That grossed me out. So she gets all these gifts. She gives some of them to Khal Drogo. And then she gets the gifts of the 3 dragon eggs, which is a huge, huge moment. And I just want to state right here that I don't think anyone read that and thought, I wonder if those... Oh, they thought, I wonder if those dragons are going to hatch.
Right, yeah, right. I know. It was like, even though he wrote it subtly, like he did explain the colors of the eggs and everything, like you could just tell, like that is going to be an important part of this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, especially with the narrative talking like, oh, they're made of stone.
Right, yeah.
Happen.
Yeah.
So the dragon eggs are gifted. Then Khal Drogo brings his gift, which is a magnificent silver horse. Mm-hmm. She rides it, and she gets a lot of confidence, and she's like, wow, like, that was really awesome. Like, I jumped over a freaking fire pit, you know?
Yeah.
And then her and Khal Drogo go off, consummate their marriage, and that's a whole scene that we're going to get into.
Yes.
So what did you think about the chapter? Did you like it? Were you like, man, this is way too much? Or like, what would you think?
So I loved the chapter. Of course, I'm a big Dany fan. Forget the last season, but I'm a big Dany fan. And I thought it felt longer than the other chapters. It felt a lot more descriptive. But even though we've already had a Dany chapter, like this was the real beginning of her story, I felt. You know, we learned who her character is. We learned, kind of her background. But this was really the start of Daenerys Targaryen.
Yeah, this was the push. That's like, all right, let's get this rolling. This is what she's going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I also feel like even though it was subtle, there was still great leaps for her character in this chapter. It was one of the first few times that she had actually made a couple of decisions on her own without being fearful of Viserys or anyone else. So I really enjoyed seeing her character come out of her shell like that.
Well, yeah, especially when she gets on the horse. I feel like that was just the most freeing thing for her.
Yes.
And I remember the first time I read it, I was like, that was probably the cheesiest thing I've ever seen.
I know. I read it at first and I was just like, wow, she got on a horse. It's a good thing she's marrying a horse lord. You know what I mean? But when you really get into it, I wrote down the quote. It says, "The silver horse leapt the flames as if she had wings." And I feel like that was just her character going, bam. You know what I mean? Yeah. But, so I really enjoyed that.
That's cool. No, that definitely, that could be maybe even a tiny foreshadow, like, hey, she's going to ride a dragon.
Right, exactly. Yeah, over a fire with some wings. Yeah.
Or who knows, maybe there's a flying horse out there. Okay, here. I was wondering if you want to go through the dream with me and see if we can kind of pick it apart a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to read it and just kind of stash your thoughts. So, yet that night she dreamt of one. She says, "There are no more dragons," Dany thought, staring at her brother, though she did not dare say it aloud. Yet that night she dreamt of one. Viserys was hurting her. She was naked, clumsy with fear. She ran from him, but her body seemed thick and ungainly. He struck her again. She stumbled and fell. "You woke the dragon," he screamed, and he kicked her. "You woke the dragon. You woke the dragon." Her thighs were slick with blood. She closed her eyes and whimpered. As if in answer, there was a hideous ripping sound and crackling of some great fire. When she looked again, Viserys was gone. Great columns of flames rose all around, and in the midst of them was the dragon. It turned its great head slowly. When its molten eyes found hers, she woke, shaking and covered with a fine sheen of sweat. She had never been so afraid. So, just give me your quick, what do you think what does that mean?
So, to me, there was so much symbolism between that dream and the events that led up to the actual birth of the dragons. First, you had, even though it was Viserys in there, you had the blood between her legs could go two different ways. It's one, when you think of blood between a woman's legs, you kind of can go to the birth aspect.
You're right.
You know what I mean? So
totally. We
lead to the birth of the dragons through this symbolism, but also the pain and the sacrifice that she had to go through. If it follows the show, we go through and she loses her child. And, she loses the one she loves. So the pain and the sacrifice that she had to go through to bring these dragons into the world, I think is symbolized there. Also, let's see what else I wrote down here. Gotta pull my glasses out.
Get your glasses out.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right? I think also the fear aspect, once we go forward and she loses Drogo and she loses the baby and she gains these dragons, not only is she, she's alone. She's afraid and she's alone and she's been thrust into this position of, I have to lead the Khalasar. I have these 3 baby dragons now. So I can definitely see where the fear aspect would come into that symbolism as well. And then just the literal phrase of, "You woke the dragon," that is going to lead to, she brought these dragons back into the world after thousands of years of not being there. So I really just thought that the symbolism between that dream and the events that lead up to that are just so cohesive.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so let's see, there's a couple spots in here that I wanted to mention. I do like, it says that she ran from him, but her body seemed thick and ungainly. I feel like that's kind of talking about how Viserys has always controlled her. She's not in control of herself. She's struggling to become who she wants to become. What I find really, it's talking about Viserys beating her, and then he's gone, and then the dragon shows up, and then at the very end it says she was so afraid. And so I think a lot of people, when they first read that, they think like, oh, Viserys turned into the dragon. It's, his abuse is becoming so strong and so controlling over her that this dragon literally shows up to stop her. I think you're right. This is basically a dream of her future. When it says Viserys is gone, it just means he's dead. And he's gone.
Yes.
He's out of the picture. It talks about, let's see, I do think the blood between her legs is her miscarriage. The great columns of flame rose all around her, and in the midst was the dragon. I think that's Khal Drogo's funeral pyre.
The funeral pyre, yeah.
Yeah. The
definitely.
going up, the dragons literally appear. I think it's really interesting how, you have this dream and you're like, oh, there's probably all this symbolism and this means that X, and it's like, no, this is literally just, this is what's happening. Viserys is gone, he's dead.
And
there's a fire,
and right. And had I not watched the shows beforehand, you might not have picked up on that. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Just because Viserys is in it to begin with, and she's so terrified of Viserys, and he's so abusive to her, you may not have picked up on that until you get farther in the book or you watch the show. But there's definitely connections there.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I definitely think some people have that talk about that power of 3 that seems to keep coming up in the books, and it definitely starts in this chapter. She's given 3 handmaidens. She's given 3 dragon eggs.
Mm-hmm.
A Dothraki affair without at least 3 deaths is a dull affair.
Fair.
You know what I mean?
There,
So
she also gets 3 weapons that she ends up gifting it.
She does, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely starts to pull in all of these different aspects, which is what makes this so fun. You know what I mean? There's just all these little pieces in here. As you read, you start going, oh, look at that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
so on that, that comment about the a Dothraki wedding is dull unless there's 3 deaths. I literally, like, George R. R. Martin could put himself in the book. He would put himself in and literally say that line because, as we know, bad things happen at weddings in this book series.
Oh, yes.
That terrible things happen. I think that's literally Grimm is looking at us and saying, if a wedding happens, bad stuff's happen. I warned you.
Yeah, you're right. I do like that. Yeah, it's kind of just like, well, if there's not a death at a wedding, it's not a wedding. You know what I mean? Like.
Okay, here, Madison asked a question. Do you think, like, that dream she had, do you think that's a magical thing? Do you think she has a power to do that? Or...
It's definitely possible. I mean, you can, we have the wargs in the show, and we have the connection between the Starks and the direwolves, and I mean, dragons are the Targaryens' version of a direwolf. So perhaps there is some sort of connection there, and maybe that was the dragons somehow being like, hey, we're here, you're gonna meet us soon. Like, this is happening. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? This is fate.
Now, okay, don't quote me on this. I'm pretty sure what happens, there's a part in the book where Dany's watching these the Red Priestess, and they're performing this fire magic, and she asks about it, and basically they're like, we don't know what happened, but at some point in the past year or whatever, our magic has basically become more powerful, and a lot of people connect that to, like, well, it was when the dragons came, like the dragons brought this more magical power in the world, and I think that could be part of it. So,
oh, definitely,
most definitely, yeah. So you have that quote from Illyrio about the deaths, and then
that's true, Madison. She mentioned the House of the Undying too, having that vision in the House of the Undying. That's true.
And I mean, it is notable. I mean, Dany has a lot of dreams in this series, like a ton, and we're gonna dive into every single one of them. Like I said, like Illyrio has a quote about deaths at the wedding, and then it says that like over a dozen men died at her wedding, which I think is kind of crazy. It's just like,
right?
Dang. It's just
pocket change to Khal Drogo, though. Yeah, I mean, come on.
Oh, okay, here. So I want to get your thoughts on this, including you, Addison, and anyone else who's listening, because I don't know if I'm right about this at all. So in the previous chapter, Illyrio was talking to Viserys, and basically he tells them, like, basically, Dothraki culture, what they do is they go around all these cities, and basically they say, hey, we're going to rape and pillage and destroy your city unless you give us something. Mm-hmm. So I was always trying to figure out, like, okay, why in the world is Khal Drogo even interested in Dany? Like, it just doesn't, like, what makes sense there? So my thought was, okay, maybe these Dothraki showed up, and they're like, hey, we're going to kill Pentos, we're going to take out Tyrosh, we're going to kill all these places. Mm-hmm. And Illyrio took advantage of that and said, hey, I'll give you Dany to protect. It'll, not only is it protecting our city, but it's going to go along with his plans to invade Westeros later on. We'll get into that later on. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I think that might be a reasoning that basically Illyrio is pushing on this gift to say, hey, I'm gonna kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'm gonna get a Dothraki army to go invade Westeros, and I'm going to make sure that Pentos and all these places don't get destroyed, because if they get destroyed, then I lose all my trade partners, and I might die.
Right. I definitely think that's part of it. To Khal Drogo, you've never had a Khal who has married a silver-haired Targaryen, so she's kind of like this rare treasure that nobody's gotten their hands on before. So I think Khal Drogo recognized that difference and perhaps that power, you know what I mean? And I'm sure Illyrio talked them up, they're descendants of the dragons. Yeah. What's more powerful than a dragon? So
this is the real thing. And if I recall my history correctly, So the Valyrians were like, basically they conquered Essos, like they were in control of everything. And once they died, I think that's basically when the Dothraki sort of came in and became a people and started ruling the Dothraki Sea. And maybe it's Khal Drogo sort of has this, hey, I'm marrying a person who is related to the people who conquered us, and now we conquer you. That might be a thing. I'd have to double check my history lessons on that. But okay, is there anything else you want to do before we talk about that awkward, cringy end scene?
Awkward, cringy end scene? I like the end scene.
Oh, really? Okay. We're gonna have a great scene.
Yes.
Okay, so here, let's just scooch forward a little bit then. Okay, so we get to this end scene, and I think we all sort of had this thought of like, okay, Khal Drogo's like this big burly dude, and he's probably gonna rape her, and it's not gonna go good. And then we get this sort of flip, and it ends up being this really tender one-on-one moment.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Okay. Now that's very different from what the show showed us. The show, was, he just rapes her basically.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts? Do you think the book did it right? The show did it right? What do you think?
So, I liked the book version. Amelia and Jason, they have great chemistry. You know, they really sell it on the show. But I feel like the book showed a more plausible path to them falling in love as passionately as they did. As much as they had chemistry on the show, the show still kind of felt like Stockholm syndrome. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So I feel like the book, you know, Khal Drogo really being tender and kind of making it Dany's choice just laid the pathwork for them to actually come together and be this forced couple, and love each other so passionately. Yeah, so I also think that it was a nice transition for, you know, she thought the way Viserys talked about him, you know, he's a dragon lord come past, and he's powerful, and he's never lost a fight, and all this other stuff, and for her, she was afraid. She basically figured she was walking straight into another Viserys. And the fact that Khal Drogo turned out to be, you know, concerned about her feelings, you know, wiping away her tears and not rushing her, and, you know, basically asking her whether she wanted to go forward with it or not. I think that was a great transition for her to make. So I really enjoyed the book version. I thought it was much better than the show version, and it made more sense to me, really.
Okay. Well, also, especially when, so you kind of the order of the whole chapter is, she's totally terrified, she gets on the horse, and she's like, sweet, things are great, and she's riding towards the river or whatever with him, and she's terrified again.
Like,
oh, hey, it's all good. You know?
Yeah, like, this isn't so bad.
Let me ask you this. Okay, so, I hope I don't hit any buttons here or whatever, but so let's say if you walked up to someone who's never saw Game of Thrones and you said, yeah, there's this scene where this 13-year-old girl and this guy in his late 20s have sex, what do you think their thoughts are? They're gonna be like, what the fuck are you like?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like, you watch the show because, like,
right?
You know, yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you this: so why is it that we can read this chapter, know that Dany is like 13, and we're like, okay, things are fine? Like what? Like
true.
You know?
I think just knowing the time period, like if she's flowered and become a woman, like, this is kind of just what's expected. I mean, some younger ladies were married off to men way older than he was. So, and, you know, they had to go through the whole, what is that, the Lord's right or the King's right, where they can just be taken from their, but it's Jason Momoa. Madison says, that's right. That's the key.
we can close this down now. We're good.
I do love watching some Jason Momoa, but yeah, so I definitely think that, you know, one, you just got to put yourself in the time period, like, you know, that was kind of the norm there, and two, because of that tenderness, it made it a little less creepy, you know what I mean?
Okay,
so
I get it.
Yeah,
I get it.
And it's not, I mean, we also watch twins have sex, so, you know.
I also think I never thought of Dany as 13, because, I mean, just think about any 13-year-old you know. And I doubt they're of the maturity level that Dany is. Especially in Dany's first chapter. So Illyrio's like talking to Viserys, and, you know, he's like, you know, manipulating him, and it's like, oh yeah, like, tons of people want you to be king and everything. And Dany, like, totally sees right through it and is like, whatever. Bullcrap.
Right.
Like,
yeah. She is very mature and very observant for her age. You're right. It doesn't feel like she's 13.
Exactly.
Like, that just is kind of like an afterthought almost.
Right. And I don't know. As far as I remember, I've read things where George R. R. Martin's basically like, I should have aged them up a little bit. especially when it comes to like Arya's like 6 or something like that.
I know, they're teeny tiny. They're babies.
They're all babies. So I don't know. I think I just naturally age them up a little bit more, just so I feel comfortable. And I think I think if he could rewrite it, he probably would age them up.
Right.
So,
well, playing on that point too, like Sansa and Dany aren't that too far apart in age, and their mental states are very, very different. Like Sansa's like the fangirl, I just want to marry the prince and be queen and all that stuff. You know what I mean?
I want to have babies.
Yes, but at the same time, that plays to their home life. You know, Sansa had a good home life. She's never had to worry about things. She's never had to be fearful in her entire life. Where Dany's had to fight for food, fight for shelter, fight her brother for, you know, so that he doesn't beat her and everything. So there's definitely that aspect too. I mean, when you go through traumatic stuff like that, you definitely grow up a lot quicker. So
most definitely. So here's my part about this scene. It's probably gonna go against the grain. But, so, personally, I think this chapter in the book was a total mistake by George R. R. Martin. And I don't think it should happen this way. I also want to say, I don't condone rape in any way. I don't want this to happen today, but I think the show actually did it better. And here's my big reasoning for it, is if we actually scooch to the next chapter in Dany, this is the line read. I'm going to quote you straight from the book about it. It says, so basically they're traveling, she's getting used to riding and all this stuff, and it's just really hard on her because she's not used to that kind of travel. And it says this, it says, even the nights brought no relief. Khal Drogo ignored her when they rode, even as he had ignored her during their wedding, and spent his evening drinking with his warriors and blood riders and so on and so forth. Yet every night, sometime before dawn, Drogo would come to her tent and wake her in the dark to ride her as relentlessly as he rode a stallion. He always took her from behind, Dothraki fashion, for which Dany was grateful. That way her lord husband could not see the tears that wet her face, and she could use her pillow to muffle her cries of pain. When he was done, he would close his eyes and begin to snore softly, and Dany would lie beside him, her body bruised and sore, hurting too much for sleep. And this is the big part for me personally. It says, day followed day, and night followed night, until Dany knew she could not endure a moment longer. She would kill herself rather than go on. Yet she decided one night. So to me,
what a difference,
right?
Yeah,
it's huge. So to me, it's like, okay, she's scared. She's confident when she rides the horse. She's scared going to consummate her marriage, and then everything's fine. And it's like, oh, okay. Like, Dany and Drogo, they're fine. Like, nothing crazy.
Right, this isn't a whole big deal, yeah.
Yeah, and then the very next chapter, it's like, she's raping her every night to the point of suicide.
Right. You're right. Yeah, so actually, you know, if I had gone ahead and know that, you're right, the show does make more sense.
Yeah, that's the thing. So, if we read the chapter and end up with her raping her, we would be like, wow, like, that's terrible. Like, she's in for this whole world of just terrible things that are going to happen to her.
Harshness, yeah.
And then when it gets to the next chapter, it's consistent. It's like, okay, like, it's still happening. So, me personally, I think that chapter should be totally rewritten and totally gotten rid of.
Yeah, I sort of agree with you. As much as I like it, I do agree with you after hearing that. But I feel like it shows more of the struggles that Dany had to go through. You know, all of a sudden she's like, oh, you know, this isn't going to be so bad. And, well, she's, you know, now she's right back to where she started. I guess it kind of...
No, that's understandable.
It is like, I guess, a character build for her. You know, she can't, it's almost like, you know, you can't trust anybody. Just when you think you can, all of a sudden, oh, wait, sorry, Dany.
God, it's honestly just, it's terrible.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so that is all the discussion questions I had for this chapter. Do you have any extra thoughts in terms of previous chapters, this chapter?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything. I'm sad you don't want to talk about why Jon knows that Septa Mordane's legs are hairy.
Okay, I just want to state everybody that what happens is this: Jon, what is it? Arya? No. Yeah, Jon says, Jon says, here, I'm going to find it.
Yeah, find it.
This is a deep question that I think everybody really needs to understand.
It's very important. Pivotal question.
It's pivotal. I think if you can answer this question, you will enjoy Game of Thrones. Okay, Jon gives the sword to Arya, and it says, the scabbard was soft gray leather, supple as sin. Jon drew out the blade slowly, so she could see the deep blue sheen of the steel. "This is no toy," he told her. "Be careful you don't cut yourself. The edges are sharp enough to shave with." "Girls don't shave," Arya said. "Maybe they should. Have you ever seen the Septa's legs?" So let me ask you this. He knows that she's got hairy legs.
He does. He does. Scandalous.
Exactly.
So when I read that, I just pictured, especially with like the warm goodbye from Arya and, you know, the family setting in Winterfell, I just picture like all of the children ganging together in some terrible joke against the Septa, and she ends up like flat on her back on the floor,
Probably.
skirts overhead, you know what I mean? And they're like, ha ha ha, you know, but.
Gosh, just so you know, it blows my mind that you actually have an answer for that, because that was a total I just put it up there because I was like, that's fine. That'll be fun.
But, all right, well, Harrison, thank you. This was great.
No, this went really, really well, and I'm excited for next week.
Me too.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Brooke. All right, we'll see you, Brooke.
All right, bye, Harrison.
Bye. But hey, guys, so I shared a lot of my thoughts, and Madison and Brooke and Shelby, we all shared our thoughts in the video. I'm gonna put my thoughts up on the group as well. I'm gonna write them down, put them in the post as well. So if anybody doesn't want to watch the show, I'm just gonna put up my thoughts on the post as well. Guys, thanks so much for joining. That was a ton of fun, and I can't wait to do it next week, guys. Okay, we'll see you, and we'll keep you guys updated on when it's gonna happen. The times might change. I just had a really busy day. It might be earlier in the day or whatever. All right, see you guys. Thanks for joining.